Okay, let's dive in. You've brought us some really meaty source material today. These are excerpts from Ray Dalio's big work, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order.
That's right. And our mission here, yours and ours, is really to cut through the detail and pull out what matters most. We want to see how Dalio's framework, these big historical patterns, might help us make sense of what's happening.
Yeah, with economies, markets, maybe even our own lives day to day.
Exactly. Because the core idea, and it's a powerful one, isn't that history repeats exactly?
No, it rhymes. That's the phrase he uses.
It rhymes. Similar causes lead to similar effects, driven by, well, timeless things like human nature playing out in these big universal cycles.
So we'll trace this whole thing back from like a personal shock he experienced.
Yeah, the 1971 Nixon shock, all the way to these huge sweeping patterns of empires rising and falling over centuries. And we'll look at what those cycles, especially around debt, internal conflict, and, the big one, U.S.-China dynamics might be telling us about right now.
Understanding the mechanics, the engine under the hood, without getting lost in every single news headline.
Precisely. It's about the deeper currents.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning for Dalio.
Yeah.
What really kicked this whole massive study off?
Right. What was the spark?
It really goes back to August 15th, 1971. President Nixon goes on TV, says the U.S. is basically breaking the dollar's link to gold, ending Bretton Woods.
Okay.
Dalio's on the trading floor the next day, fully expecting, a market crash. Chaos.
But that's not what happened.
Nope. The market surged. It went up. And for him, that was just completely shocking. He'd never lived through a major currency devaluation before.
Right.
And that painful surprise, that feeling of being blindsided, that was the catalyst. It just drove home this absolute need to understand the huge economic and market shifts, not just in his lifetime, but way back, like 100+ years, across major countries.
So it wasn't just academic curiosity, it was practical. Like, I need to figure this out so it doesn't happen to me again.
Fundamentally, yes. Don't get caught flat-footed by history rhyming.
Yeah.
And as he dug in, he started seeing these patterns everywhere. Populism popping up,
Yeah.
conflict between the economic left and right, and especially these huge gaps in wealth and opportunity. He actually did specific research, splitting the U.S., sort of top 40%, bottom 60%,
Interesting.
and found massive differences.
Yeah.
Wealth, health outcomes, education. It helped explain the rising polarity of the populism he was seeing.
And that research fed into his bigger thinking about capitalism itself, maybe needing reform.
Correct. It's all connected for him. Plus, you add in his decades of international work, especially his 37 years going back and forth to China, building relationships.
So he wasn't just reading history books, he was seeing massive global shifts firsthand.
Exactly. He had a front row seat. And all this experience, all this research, it led to some really big fundamental questions.
Like what?
Like, okay, when and why might the U.S. dollar stop being the world's main reserve currency? That's huge. If it happens, what comes next?
Yeah.
How does that change everything?
Wow, yeah.
And what about these big gaps within countries, the internal conflicts? Where does that eventually lead?
So facing these enormous questions, his approach wasn't to, like, memorize every date and name.
No, not at all. He stresses looking at mega macro cycles. Really long time frames, hundreds of years. You kind of have to squint, let go of the tiny details to see the big shapes, the overarching patterns.
Yet you still need the details sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. You need to know when to zoom back in on what's crucial. And he leaned heavily on Bridgewater, his company, The Tools. Hundreds of people processing insane amounts of data across countries, markets.
Like building a giant machine to understand how the world machine works?
Pretty much, yeah. And using that to inform this historical study. But he's also really upfront, which I appreciate, about uncertainty.
Right. He says these are theories, not facts.
Exactly. He says, look, I've been wrong plenty of times. That's why diversification is so important. He's just sharing his thinking, his framework.
And he presents it in different ways, videos, the book, more detailed stuff online, aiming for clarity, maybe not perfect academic footnotes everywhere.
The goal isn't to lecture. It's to explore these cause and effect links with you, the listener. Use that historical understanding to think about the future. Maybe agree on some principles for navigating it.
Okay, so let's get into that core framework then, this big cycle archetype. What is it, fundamentally?
The basic idea is that we might be living through one of these massive shifts right now. A huge change in who has wealth, who has power globally, and it profoundly affects everyone.
And it's not random, it follows a pattern, an archetype.
Exactly. An archetype, a pattern that repeats throughout history. He argues that the things driving the rise and fall of empires, they happen in these classic interconnected cycles that reinforce each other, creating one really big cycle.
And he zooms in on three specific cycles as being the most important.
Yes, the big three are: 1, the long-term debt and capital market cycle; 2, the internal order and disorder cycle, what's happening inside a country; and 3, the external order and disorder cycle, how countries relate to each other.
And his claim is these are basically timeless, driven by human nature, how economies work.
Pretty much. The technology changes, the names change, but the underlying dynamics of debt, internal power struggles, external competition, those have been around for thousands of years.
So how does this big cycle usually play out? What are the basic phases?
You can think of it broadly in 3 stages. There's the rise,
Okay.
then implicitly a period at the top where things start to turn,
Right.
and then the decline.
Tell us about the rise. What does that look like? Sounds like the good part.
It often is, yeah. It's
Okay.
the building phase, usually after some big conflict or revolution resets things.
Yeah.
This is when a country is building its fundamental strengths. You typically see low debt, smaller gaps between rich and poor, people working together pretty well, good education, building infrastructure, strong leadership. And often, the world order is relatively peaceful, maybe guided by one dominant power.
So the golden age, kind of?
You could call it that.
Yeah.
But importantly, the seeds of the next phase are often sown during this prosperous time.
Mm.
You reach the top, and the things that drove the rise start getting, well, excessive.
Yeah.
Debt climbs, the gaps widen, cooperation frays.
So the decline forces start gathering steam.
Exactly. Which leads, eventually, to the decline phase. The core strengths weaken, and the excesses built up earlier become major problems, destabilizing things.
Now, you mentioned Dalio identifies like 18 key factors or determinants driving this rise and fall. We don't need all 18, but can you touch on some key examples that really pop out from the sources?
Sure. Geography is one. Think about the U.S. or China, these huge, fairly unified land masses, versus maybe the more fragmented geography of Europe. That matters.
Okay.
Strong leadership and just well-designed systems, how the government works, that's critical.
And education comes up a lot, but it's not just about reading and writing, is it?
No, definitely not. He emphasizes knowledge, skills, but also character, civility, work ethic, respecting rules, low corruption. You need those for people to cooperate and for the whole system to function properly.
Right, that human capital.
And that strength often fuels the shift from just making basic stuff to real innovation, invention. Think of the Dutch with their ships and finance, or the British during the Industrial Revolution.
Being open to ideas from elsewhere is also key.
Yes, absorbing the best global thinking gives you an edge. And the sources stress having everyone, workers, government, military, kind of pulling in the same direction, working well together.
And that collective effort shows up economically.
Yeah, in rising productivity, becoming more competitive globally, gaining a bigger share of world trade.
Which then often leads to needing a stronger military.
To protect those trade routes, those expanding interests, yeah. Beyond that, there's a really fundamental economic rule he hits hard. Countries, like people, have to eventually earn at least what they spend.
Live within your means, basically.
Over the long run, yes. Persistent deficits, borrowing too much. History shows that path leads to trouble, turbulence down the line.
And there's a human nature element here too, right? The short-term versus long-term thing.
Absolutely. That basic drive for wealth and power, combined with our tendency to prefer pleasure now over pain later. Politicians, especially, wanting to get reelected, find it hard to make tough long-term choices.
Easier to kick the can down the road.
It often is, politically. But doing that, borrowing from the future, just makes the eventual bust worse. And finally, he highlights class struggles.
How does that fit in?
Well, societies always have groups. Rich, poor, different races, religions, whatever. Power is usually concentrated. In good times, early in the cycle, there's generally more harmony. People feel the pie is growing.
But in bad times.
Late in the cycle, when the economy struggles, those divisions get sharper. Fighting between groups increases, and that really hits internal stability hard.
Okay, let's zoom back in on those three big cycles. Starting with number 1, the long-term debt, money, and capital markets cycle. What's the key distinction he makes here?
It's the crucial difference between real wealth and financial wealth.
Okay, break that down.
Real wealth is actual stuff, things with intrinsic value factories, land, knowledge, skills, the ability to produce things. Financial wealth is just claims on that, real wealth, money, stocks, bonds, IOUs.
So paper versus reality.
In a sense, yeah. Financial wealth has no value on its own. It's only worth what real stuff it can buy. And real wealth comes from being productive, making things, solving problems, not just shuffling paper claims around.
And he has that stark phrase, debt eats equity.
Meaning, when push comes to shove, debts have priority. If your income drops or your assets fall below your debts, you eventually have to sell your real assets, your house, your business to pay off those financial claims.
Got it. And money and credit aren't fixed things. Central banks can just create them.
This is so important. Central banks can essentially create money and credit out of thin air. Doing that stimulates the economy, more spending, asset prices go up, businesses produce more.
That's good.
In the short term, maybe. But that debt doesn't just disappear. It has to be dealt with, eventually either paid back, which means spending less than you earn, and that slows things down, or it gets wiped out somehow. This whole creation and destruction dynamic makes the economy inherently cyclical.
And central banks try to manage this, like driving a car, speeding up, slowing down.
Exactly. They adjust interest rates, the availability of credit, make it cheap and easy to borrow to stimulate, make it expensive and hard to slow things down. But, and this is key, their ability to keep doing that effectively gets limited, especially late in the long cycle.
Which brings us to the long-term debt cycle itself, much longer than the business cycles we hear about all the time.
Right, we're talking 50 to 75 years, typically. It contains lots of those shorter ups and downs within it. But the big, major debt crises, they only happen maybe once in a person's lifetime.
So people forget, or they've never experienced one.
Exactly. They get caught completely by surprise when it finally arrives.
And in Dalio's framework, the current cycle started after World War II, around 1945 with Bretton Woods.
Yes. And now, roughly 75 years later, we're likely in the late cycle phase.
How does the mechanism usually work? How does the debt get out of control?
It often starts with hard money, like gold. Then banks create credit, lending out more claims on that hard money than actually exists. This fuels a boom. Stage 3. Debts start growing faster than the income needed to service them.
So what happens then? Governments just raise taxes or cut spending?
Well, that's the hard way. Politically, it's often much easier for central banks to step in and just print money to buy the debt. It's called debt monetization.
Sounds less painful up front.
It is. But printing money and buying debt fundamentally devalues the money and the debt itself. It's like a hidden tax on anyone holding that currency or those bonds. Their purchasing power goes down.
But it helps the debtors.
Big time. Their debts become easier to pay off and cheaper money. This whole process can drive people holding the currency or debt to look for alternatives. Maybe hard assets like gold, maybe certain types of stocks, maybe assets in other countries with stronger currencies.
And governments don't like that capital flowing out.
No. Historically, they've sometimes tried to stop it, outlawing gold ownership, putting controls on foreign exchange, or moving capital abroad. But ultimately, the source material says the massive debt overhang usually gets resolved in one of two ways: massive devaluation of the currency or outright default, wiping the slate clean.
And there are historical examples.
Plenty. Germany's Weimar Republic hyperinflation, Argentina in the 80s, the global debt crisis in the 1930s leading to countries devaluing against each other, and definitely after World War II, where debts were inflated away, defaulted on, especially for the losers, but even for some winners.
Does devaluing your currency mean you automatically lose reserve currency status?
Not necessarily from one devaluation, but chronic devaluation, constantly printing money to cover debts, erodes trust. It makes people question the long-term value of holding that currency. So yes, it's a major factor contributing to losing reserve status eventually. Late in the cycle, the odds of some kind of systemic breakdown go way up.
What about gold's role in all this?
Historically, the source notes from like 1850 to 1971, gold's real return basically just offset inflation. It held its value. But when the U.S. broke the gold link in 71, moving to pure fiat money.
Fiat meaning backed by nothing but government promise.
Exactly. That gave central banks basically unlimited power to create money. That led to the high inflation of the 70s, and gold appreciated a lot until interest rates were jacked up really high in the early 80s to break inflation's back.
Okay, that's the debt cycle. Let's move to the second one, the internal order and disorder cycle. What drives this one?
This is about what happens inside a country, the governance system, how people get along or don't. And it's deeply connected to the external world order, too. The core driver here is that constant, timeless struggle for wealth and power within a society.
And Dalio outlines 6 stages for this internal cycle, like stages of life or a disease.
Yeah, it tends to follow a pattern. Stage 1 is the new order. This comes right after the low point. Stage 6, which is revolution or civil war. New leaders emerge, they consolidate power, often ruthlessly dealing with opposition. Think purges.
It's tough.
It often is. Successful leaders at this stage are usually strong fighters, politically savvy. Think of historical figures like Emperor Taizong in China or Caesar Augustus in Rome.
Then hopefully things get better.
Ideally, yes. The cycle moves toward stage 3, the high point peace and prosperity. But success breeds its own problems. Excesses creep in, tensions build under the surface.
Leading to stages 4 and 5.
Right, these are stages of increasing excess, maybe decadence, and worsening conditions overall. Stage 5 is really critical. It's marked by bad financial conditions and intense conflict.
So the economy tanks and people start fighting.
Pretty much. Those class tensions, the gaps between groups, they explode when times get tough financially. And the source highlights how information becomes a weapon here.
Media polarization.
Yes, sensationalism, politically motivated attacks, trust in media creators, even the legal system, the police, can become politicized, used as weapons. You see rising protests, sometimes turning violent. Leaders are stuck, crack down and risk more violence, or let it go and risk revolution.
That sounds like a dangerous tipping point.
It is. Crossing that line into widespread, violent fighting marks the transition to stage 6, civil war or revolution. That's the absolute low point of the internal cycle.
How long do these internal cycles usually take?
The big arc is typically around 100 years, give or take. But you have smaller cycles within that, political cycles, maybe 8 years, the shorter debt cycles. And crucially, different countries are at different stages at the same time.
Like China versus the US right now.
Potentially, yes. And that difference in their internal stage massively affects how they interact externally. The source uses Japan's Meiji Restoration in the 1860s as an example, a revolution triggered by internal problems that led to a complete transformation.
Okay, cycle 3, the external order and disorder cycle. Conflict between countries.
Right. This is about the competition and conflict between nations or empires over, again, wealth and power, but also often over ideology, different ways of seeing the world. Dalio breaks it down into 5 types of wars.
5 types.
Yeah. Trade wars, tariffs, sanctions, capital wars blocking investment or access to markets, technology wars competing over innovation, blocking technology transfer, geopolitical wars struggling for influence, alliances, proxy conflicts, and finally, military wars, actual shooting.
And the ideas, they tend to escalate.
Yes. The first 4 are all forms of power struggle, just using different tools, and historically they often build on each other and could eventually lead to military conflict.
The sources also warn about the risk of, well, stupid wars.
Wars that end up costing way more than any possible gain. They happen for various reasons, like the prisoner's dilemma, where rational self-interest on both sides leads to a bad outcome for everyone. Tit-for-tat escalation that spirals, leaders feeling they can't back down without looking weak, especially if their power is declining. And just simple misunderstandings in tense situations.
Timing and how you use power is crucial in this external game.
Absolutely. You ideally want to fight, if you must, when you're strongest relative to your rival. If you think you're declining, maybe fight sooner. If you're rising, maybe wait. And how you wield power matters. Sometimes keeping it hidden, like a threat, is more effective than showing it, unless you need it for negotiation or deterrence. Understanding what your opponent truly values is key.
Are there examples of these non-military wars having big consequences?
Definitely. The source mentions Germany banning Russian bonds in the 1880s, hurting Russia financially, or the U.S. oil embargo and Panama Canal blockage against Japan in 1941, which was a major factor leading to Pearl Harbor. The British used economic warfare effectively against rivals, too.
And proxy wars are common.
Yes. Fighting through third parties is a way to weaken a rival without a direct, potentially catastrophic confrontation. And critically, if a country is experiencing severe internal disorder.
Stage 5 or 6.
Exactly. That's seen as a moment of weakness, an opportunity for its external rivals to press their advantage. Think of Japan invading China during China's Civil War in the 1930s. These cycles are all linked.
The source walks through some historical empires to illustrate these patterns. Let's briefly touch on a few.
Yeah.
The Dutch, for instance, first global reserve currency.
Right. They rose on the back of incredible innovation shifts, but also capitalism itself. Modern banking with the Bank of Amsterdam. Unbeatable trade networks, the Dutch East India Company. The guilder became the currency because they dominated trade and finance, and their bank had sound policies.
And their decline
followed the classic financial script debt, losing competitiveness. Though the guilder status lingered for a while even after their peak power faded.
Then came the British Empire.
Similar story, different players. Rose through strengths in education, amazing inventiveness during the Industrial Revolution, access to capital, global trade dominance, and unmatched military power, especially the Navy. The pound sterling took over as the reserve currency. Their splendid isolation policy for a time let them focus on building the empire.
But they hit the downward slope too.
Yes, wars are expensive. Fighting Napoleon cost a fortune. Later, World War I and II saddled Britain with enormous debts. The devaluations that followed seriously weakened the pound's global position.
Setting the stage for the U.S. and the dollar.
Exactly. The U.S. financial system was rocky early on, lots of bank panics before the Fed. But the U.S. rose incredibly fast. Massive economic output, growing share of world trade, innovation, deep financial markets. The dollar gradually became more important, and its dominance was cemented after World War II with the Bretton Woods system.
And the source draws parallels between past crises and recent ones, like 2008.
Absolutely. It highlights how the 2008 crash led the Fed and other central banks to slash rates to zero and print massive amounts of money, quantitative easing, or QE.
Right.
This pumped up financial asset prices significantly after 2009, similar, he notes, to what happened in the U.S. from 1933 to 36 after their big crisis. But a key consequence was widening wealth gaps.
Which connects back to internal disorder.
Directly. That widening gap fueled the rise in populism and nationalism we've seen globally, echoing patterns from the 1930s.
China's story is framed differently, not rise, fall, rise within the modern system, but a long decline than a super fast rise.
Yes, a long period of relative decline for about 200 years, then this incredibly rapid ascent since the late 1970s. But driven by the same underlying forces, even China's own long dynastic history shows the cycles. Founders consolidate power, invest, innovate, prosper. Then later dynasties decline due to weak leaders, financial messes often involving printing money, underinvestment, becoming vulnerable. One difference noted is China historically wasn't as consistently supportive of commerce and finance as, say, European powers.
Then the Mao era was different again.
Consolidation, state control, isolation. Followed by Deng Xiaoping opening things up, market reforms, building financial strength, developing that symbiotic trade relationship with the U.S. motion. China makes stuff and lends money. The U.S. buys stuff and borrows.
And the current Xi Jinping era.
Characterized by accelerated reforms, trying to manage debt, huge pushes in technology, a much more assertive global posture, addressing inequality and environment, but also consolidating political control. China's now a peer competitor in trade, output, increasingly tech and military, but still lagging significantly in finance and reserve currency status.
So let's bring this right up to today. How does this framework analyze the current U.S.-China dynamic? Where do they stand in these cycles?
Well, according to the analysis and the source, the U.S. is currently in a relatively less favorable spot, economically and financially. High foreign debt, lower projected growth around 1.1% cited not much room to cut interest rates, and already heavily monetizing debt. In a somewhat better position on those metrics. Higher expected growth, 4.3% cited, and a comparatively lower debt burden relative to its economy size.
What about internally? The order-disorder cycle.
Here, the picture flips somewhat. The source describes the U.S. as having large gaps, wealth, opportunity, values, leading to high internal conflict. It points to things like deep political polarization in polls, distrust, emotional attacks, even concerns about potential violence as markers consistent with late stage 5 of that internal cycle.
That sounds serious.
It is. The U.S. system has been resilient, but abandoning its core principles would be, as the source says, traumatic. China, while having significant wealth gaps, is described as having more average levels of overt internal conflict, putting its overall internal order risk as moderate currently.
How does that internal situation affect their external relationship?
Massively. The source is clear. The U.S. and China are already engaged in 4 of those 5 types of war: trade war, tech war, capital war, and geopolitical war for influence.
But not the 5th type.
Yep.
Not military war.
Not yet. But the intensity of the first 4 is rising. And historically, that period of escalating non-military conflict often precedes military conflict by, say, 5 to 10 years. The 1930s leading to WWII is the key parallel drawn.
Can you give examples of these current wars?
Sure. Trade war, the tariffs, restrictions, tech war, the whole push to decouple supply chains, restrictions on companies like Huawei, fights over semiconductor access, capital war threats to restrict investment flows, delist companies, geopolitical war, competing for allies and influence all over the world, countries feeling pressured to choose sides.
And what about the dollar's reserve status in this conflict?
That's a huge vulnerability for the U.S., potentially. If the U.S. government takes actions seen as weaponizing the dollar, like threatening China's vast holdings, or using sanctions aggressively against others, it incentivizes countries like China and Russia to speed up developing alternatives. different payment systems, digital currencies, ways to bypass the dollar system entirely.
What's seen as the single biggest flashpoint for actual military conflict?
Taiwan, unequivocally. China's absolute insistence that Taiwan is part of China clashes directly with the U.S.'s ambiguous commitment and arms sales.
How does the military balance look there?
The source suggests China is already stronger militarily right there in the region, and its strength is likely growing faster than the U.S.'s ability to project power there. However, the risk of mutually assured destruction nuclear deterrence likely prevents an all-out war for survival. But Taiwan remains the specific issue where a limited but still devastating military conflict could realistically erupt in the next decade.
The source gives a probability estimate for that.
Yeah, acknowledging it's a wild guess, but based on historical patterns of rising versus ruling powers with irreconcilable differences in military buildups, Dalio estimates a 35% chance of a major war in the next 10 years.
35%. That sounds dangerously high.
He explicitly calls it a dangerously high risk.
And this conflict is driving decoupling, separating the economies.
Yes. Both sides are pushing towards more domestic production, less reliance on the other, especially in strategic sectors. The expectation in the source is that China might be able to reduce its dependencies faster over the next 5–10 years.
Finally, the source mentions deep cultural differences.
Right. American individualism versus Chinese collectivism, free speech versus respect for authority. These aren't just minor disagreements. They represent fundamentally different ways of organizing society, potentially irreconcilable differences that people might, tragically, fight over. Systems need respect and flexibility to survive.
It's striking how, after all this global analysis, the source brings it back to something internal, the war with ourselves.
Yes, that's a powerful concluding idea. The argument is that a nation's most critical battle is always internal. It's about maintaining its own strength, measured by those 18 determinants we touched on: education, character, civility, working together, allocating resources well, being open.
So how well a country is doing in that internal war determines its resilience.
That's the core idea. That internal strength, or lack thereof, is the foundation for how it weathers the debt cycles and navigates the external conflicts.
So looking ahead then, say the next 10 years, what does this framework tell us to really focus on?
The source suggests watching the interplay between a few key things. The shorter-term business debt cycle, which usually runs about 8 years or so.
Okay.
The internal political cycles, also often around 8 years in democracies. And crucially, the intensifying U.S.-China competition and this whole decoupling process.
And we're currently in a short-term cycle that started with that huge stimulus back in April 2020.
Right, after the pandemic shock. These cycles aren't exact timers, obviously. They're driven by the underlying economics, how much slack is there, are bubbles forming, how are central banks reacting, how sensitive is the economy to those reactions.
And Dalio offers a core principle for dealing with all this uncertainty.
Yes, it comes from his own painful experience of nearly going bust. His principle is, first, figure out what your absolute worst-case, intolerable outcomes are and make sure you're protected against them.
Like having a safety net.
Exactly. And an end-of-the-world portfolio,
Yeah.
diversified enough to survive almost anything. Once you have that safety, you're free. You have the peace of mind and the capacity to then go after opportunities without risking utter ruin.
Wow. Okay, this has been a really comprehensive deep dive. We've gone from Dalio's personal wake-up call through the mechanics of these huge interconnected cycles, debt, internal order, external order, seen them play out in history.
Right, with the Dutch, the British, the U.S., China.
And then applied that whole lens to the current moment, especially the U.S.-China relationship.
And the main takeaway really is that understanding these repeating patterns from history gives you a framework. It helps you see beyond the daily noise, put today's events in a much broader context, and anticipate the range of possibilities ahead, even if you can't predict the exact future.
And we definitely highlighted some critical markers for right now, where we seem to be in the long-term debt cycle, the high levels of internal polarization in some key countries, and this escalating great power competition.
It's a way of thinking, a mental model, to help you interpret the complex world we're in.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. As you watch events unfold, as you make your own decisions, financial, personal, whatever, consider this. How might these large, impersonal historical forces, these cycles we've discussed, be shaping the world you experience? How might they be influencing your choices, maybe even unconsciously? And what does that idea of the war with ourselves, a nation's internal strength, its people's character and ability to cooperate, mean for navigating whatever comes next?
It's worth keeping these patterns in mind. They offer a really valuable perspective on the present and the potential paths forward. Keep observing, keep reflecting.